Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perticchese, and thank you for joining me as always. On the other side, Jeff Abercrombie. Jeff, welcome back. I've missed having you across the board.
Hey, Paul. Definitely excited to be here with Matt, and we've got a great live episode going.
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody who's joining us on YouTube, welcome. Obviously, the audio version of the podcast will be out as usual tomorrow or the day after. But we are extremely excited to be joined. Jeff kind of alluded to it by special guest, Mr. Matt Waldman. Matt, welcome back to the Saturday Sunday Football Podcast. We always enjoy having you here with us.
Hey, fellas, thanks so much for having me. And unlike Jeff, I think I'm happy to see you too, Paul. But no, I know Jeff's joking around. But no, I mean, this is always a fun show to be able to do, and it should be another good time for us to be able to talk about rookies with training camp around the corner here.
Yeah, absolutely. And here at Saturday Sunday, we kind of all of May, all of June, and most of July, we kind of really digest all things that happened during the NFL draft, talking about landing spots, talking about fits, talking about fantasy value, dynasty value, all that stuff before we kind of turn the page. And we were just talking off air, Matt and I, about I'm ready to start digging into the next wave of prospects. I have my list ready to start watching film probably as early as tomorrow and get into it. But we really break down every facet of the previous class post-draft rather than some sites just quickly move on, and talk about it for a week or two. We really kind of bring in a lot of analysts to pick their brains, get their opinion. I know we had you on pre-draft. We talked about a lot of players, but there were so many other players we didn't get a chance to talk about. Now we have homes and landing spots and draft capital to kind of attach to these guys. So we always enjoy having you on post-draft as well. So let's dig right into it. Let's start with the running backs. And let's not start at the top because everybody starts at the top. And where I want to start is we know that a couple of years ago, James Robinson's rookie season, it was an extreme outlier. Rare do we see a UDFA prospect have that much of a major impact in year one because the depth chart opened up. He sees the opportunity. But I really do think this year there's some intriguing late round and UDFA running backs that really landed in interesting spots that if the opportunity arises, they might be able to seize a role in a backfield. And I'm talking about guys like Kenny Brooks, who signed with the Eagles as a UDFA, Isaiah Pacheco, who was drafted in the 7th round by Kansas City, Abram Smith, who was signed as a UDFA free agent with New Orleans. Matt, can you share some thoughts on any of these guys? Do you have a favorite landing spot of these three that maybe it's an ideal fit that, scheme and fit matches their talent? And if the situation was to ever arise, like James Robinson had that a few years ago, one of these guys might be able to seize it. Obviously, we're not trying to predict another James Robinson season because, like I said, that's an extreme outlier. But maybe somebody that could seize a role and have a NFL role that is significant in their rookie year.
Absolutely. I'll start with Kennedy Brooks. He's been a favorite of mine pretty much for the past 2 years. And when you look at Philadelphia's team, you realize that Sanders isn't all that very, Miles Sanders isn't that very satisfied with what he's getting in town in terms of the number of touches he's going to get. Says it's the offense, which I think part of that's true. Part of it's the offense's reaction to Miles Sanders' play, which has been not as reliable in terms of, making the right decisions that you need to make on the field. He's a terrific athlete, but not a great technician or conceptual player in terms of decision making at the running back position. Then you have Kenneth Gainwell, who, if steroids were legal, maybe he could maybe he could shoot up WWF style and WWE style and become Tiki Barber. But I think that would require him to have explosion to his game as well. And I just don't think he has enough explosion to his game to really become the player that they seek. I think he's more of a scat back at best, unless he can figure out a way to grow some man weight, add some muscle, and add some explosion to his game. Then you have Boston Scott, who I think is probably pound for pound their best running back on the roster in terms of what he can do. But they look at him as they're going to see short and slow, even though he has great burst, great change of direction speed, and great contact balance, teams that draft people like Miles Sanders and fail, which is generally the case for a lot of teams, is that they see speed, 40 speed, and they think that's important, and they minimize processing skill. And where Boston Scott is strong, Miles Sanders is weak, Kenneth Gainwell is so-so, and so that enter Kennedy Brooks into this equation. And while he's not the fastest guy, 4.59 was faster than what some people thought he was going to run. He has good burst. He has unbelievable contact balance. And I think he understands how to read boxes pre-snap to set up what he's supposed to do within that blocking scheme, whether he should veer away from it or whether he should, make an adjustment based on what his pre-snap keys are. And he does that as well as any back in this class. I think he's a massively underrated running back who I think is going to get a shot to impress in camp enough and with running backs, this is a very important thing to understand. And I think the 49ers said this best. You don't really know what you have in a running back, especially the late round guys that you draft as camp bodies or maybe special teams guys. You don't really know what you have until you put them in live action, not in scrimmages, but actual preseason games and real games, especially real games, because we saw with a guy like Tyson Williams last year, who was a UDFA I liked a lot, and he ran with abandon for the 2 years that he got to play in scrimmages and preseason. As soon as the lights came on in the real season games, he started to play like he didn't want to lose control of the football, and he was too careful. They criticized him for that. You could see that his game kind of, from the first half of the Raiders game to the second half of that game, he went from running with confidence to don't lose the football. And it was over for him in Baltimore pretty much within the span of about 3 to 4 weeks, because he never got over that. So when you look at these players that we're going to talk about in more depth, who are coming from a UDFA perspective or late round, you want to see them in action first, because you're going to hear them in camp and you're going to hear about, he seems to always make the right decision. Like Brooks isn't going to impress a ton in camp unless he breaks a number of long runs in these scrimmages where the beat writer basically, in the middle of him recommending the Monte Cristo to somebody, suddenly turns around and sees a breeze pass by him and go, who was that? And somebody goes, that's Kennedy Brooks. And then the hive mind of the media will start to write up, oh, Kennedy Brooks had a good day, because he did something that, may not really matter in actual, until you see the actual games. But in the actual games, if he gets the shot to see extended carries in an actual game, then you're going to see that pop off, because that's when he's going to get his shot. So his best opportunity is with any of these guys we're about to talk about will have to come with either an injury, which will open the door. Like think Isaiah Crowell, another UDFA, and he's a guy I had him ranked number 1 in my in that class that year, who was a UDFA who they were about to cut in Cleveland, but then Dion Lewis got hurt, who was their main guy that they were excited about, along with the Towson kid, who, and Isaiah Crowell suddenly had a good third quarter in the third preseason game, and they had to start looking at him seriously. And he wound up being, a multi-year starter in the NFL, who probably would have continued to be at least a strong committee player to this day if he didn't tear an Achilles. So Brooks is that kind of player who, I like right off the bat. My second favorite guy is Aquandre White. To me, White is one of those guys that he is the speed back. He does have that skill in space, but he also has underrated skills in terms of diagnostic decision skills. He's just a little more up and down with it than a guy like Kennedy Brooks, who's just an absolute Frank Gore-like technician in this area. Whereas White can be a little more prone to taking advantage of his athletic ability. But here's the thing. Eli Mitchell, they called him Drano in San Francisco because he hit a hole so hard, which is the nice way of saying that he had a rocket strapped to his backside and no compass and really not great footwork to set things up. But in that offense in San Francisco, when you had George Kittle, when you had, Kyle Juszczyk, you had Trent Williams. You don't need a nuanced decision maker. You need a guy who's going to hit a hole hard and fast and immediately. And that's something that you can do with outside zone and with toss plays and gap plays, which is why Deebo Samuel got as many touches as he did when people got hurt, because they wanted speed. That's why Kyle Shanahan went with Tevin Coleman, who couldn't find his way around a hole in his first couple of years, and brought him into San Francisco. Or Jerick McKinnon, who was never going to really replace Adrian Peterson. Fast guys that are flashy and do well in the hit the scheme hard type of thing. Well, Saquandre White can do that right now, even if he has more room to develop, and he can catch the ball well. And he's a guy that has, more explosion than anybody on that roster but Raheem Mostert. And he's impressed in camp. I would not be shocked at all if they're like, let's give him a look in some of these preseason games enough and he turns it in. They might cut Myles Gaskin. They might cut some of these other players that are like proven, but just don't have great speed. And then probably the third guy that really comes to mind for me is Isaiah Pacheco. And I love that you mentioned him. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he has bursts. He doesn't have great speed. His contact balance isn't great between the tackles. He's a bully in the open field who can catch the football and run routes. You can talk about injuries all you want, but even in that Texans game, that first game where everyone went nuts and said he was great and he scored, he didn't score a touchdown, but he had over 100 yards and they were saying he was the second coming to Brian Westbrook. I mean, I posted something on that just showing that's like the game was meh, in terms of just like what he offers, as a, in terms of contact balance, decision making in the red zone, tight creases, not a great runner for that. Ronald Jones is a good runner for that. He's not a good receiver, as we all know, but he hits things hard. And he's a tackle breaker and one of the better yards after contact guys. Well, if you want a guy who has the potential to combine both of those skills into one player, it's Pacheco, because he's a good gap player. He's got excellent speed. He's a very good pass catcher, great hand-eye coordination, who I think can become a better route runner. And he kind of got knocked for Rutgers' offensive line for some of the decisions that he made that I thought actually were good decisions that people said they weren't. So if he can just hang on to getting a roster spot for that team, ahead of Jerick McKinnon, ahead of anybody that they have at the end of that roster, and he can hang on for a spot, Andy Reid will gradually work him into the lineup, because Andy Reid does that with a lot of backs who are, late round guys. He's done it with Derek Gore. He's done it with, Damian Williams. He did it with Spencer Ware. And Isaiah Pacheco has enough skills that he reminds me of kind of a Cam Akers type of back when Cam Akers was healthy. And I'd even keep an eye on Jerry Neely there, just because he can catch. He's a smart runner. He's a good route runner. And he fits in that kind of vein of what Andy Reid looks for in a guy, and he can return punts for you. So he fits that special teams vibe. So those are the three backs that really, caught my eye.
Yeah. I thanks for elaborating so well on that too, because I was going to, ask you to follow up on that, on what the landscape might look like in 2 or 3 years. And I think you really painted a great picture that, in Philadelphia, for example, they had a guy like Jordan Howard through his rookie contract, right? And, and I think Kennedy Brooks can profile as a very technically sound player that can give them that, for his early career. So maybe just, since we've touched really well on these below the radar guys, why don't we kind of like work our way up just a little bit more? Because with the NFL draft, with the positional value at running back, it seems that, the end of day 3 or end of day 2, early day 3 is really where the sweet spot is for, finding backs that can fit a role in an offense. And so, we're seeing teams like Washington, pick Brian Robinson and fill him into a committee role with, around Gibson, around McKissick. We see Kyle Shanahan make the news saying they want to use a committee approach in San Francisco and drafted Tyrion Davis-Price in the 3rd round. Isaiah Spiller came off, Samir White came off, those all, again, it seems like the teams have a role in mind. It might not be, the full workload that, fantasy players might be looking for, but, do you see that upside for any of those players? Do you have, any specific thoughts or favorites, or, any really, scheme fits that you see working really well there?
Yeah, I would say the guy that I think has the most upside for the least cost, because with this dynasty, all these guys you mentioned in Dynasty, to me, I would not get overly excited about, because they're all in committee situations, and we've seen committee upon committee in year before. It's not going to change, unless an injury strikes, and then they get to have that 1 year in the spotlight, and then they're going to go back to a committee again in most cases with these. So to me, the player that has the most upside isn't even the ones mentioned here to the cost, and that's Jerome Ford with the Cleveland Browns. And that's because he's an elusive back. He holds up physically between the tackles. He has receiving skills. And we know that Kareem Hunt and Dearness Johnson they're here for the year, but that's about it at best. One or both might get traded at some point this year. And Cleveland's going to want to recoup some of their picks, especially with everything that they've done moving forward. So when you look at Ford, he could replace Hunt in some capacity in 2023. He's one play away from earning a lead opportunity if he performs well for Cleveland this year. If they let Ernest Johnson walk, he could wind up being that, even if it's a low-end version in terms of volume of Kareem Hunt to Nick Chubb, it's still there. And if both those backs get hurt, and it is a punishing league, Jerome Ford just inherited one of the best 3 to 4 offensive lines in the league that's going to have to run the football. So for me, Jerome Ford is that guy that gives you the highest amount of upside for cost at this stage. And then talking about some of the guys that you mentioned, I mean, I think they're all mixed bag type of players for me. Like Isaiah Spiller's intriguing because, if they look at Eckler and think he's too expensive to re-sign, just due to age and everything else. And I forgive me if they did already re-sign him. Did they already re-sign him? I don't think they did.
I'll look that up.
I
think I'll look it up.
Okay. Yeah. So, it's one of those things that even if they resign him, there's two things with that. Eckler is a bit of a shrimp for a running back. And they obviously drafted Spiller earlier because they failed on Kelly. They failed on Roundtree in terms of going late with those guys. So they decided to go a little bit earlier than the guys they drafted the past 2 years in terms of running backs who might be able to fit that bill, who could give you that Melvin Gordon to Austin Eckler kind of, tandem. Maybe they want to do it as much as they did with Gordon, but they still want that element. And certainly Spiller is that guy who has the talent to reduce Eckler's role in the red zone and the ground game overall. He can be the closeout back. He can be the red zone guy. And if he plays well enough, then he could make Eckler too expensive to re-sign down the line, or decide that they don't need him in as big of a role. So Spiller's the most intriguing to me. And also it's because the Chargers are a good team, and I think that they can run the ball. They have the potential to run the ball reasonably well. I like Robinson's ability a ton, but I also love Antonio Gibson's skills. The problem is that when our dynasty community equates Antonio Gibson to the next Christian McCaffrey in terms of Christian McCaffrey's peak years, and it doesn't happen, they're all going to be disappointed. So you can let the redraft players of dynasty go nuts over that and keep taking Antonio Gibson, if you ask me, in terms of he might be at a little bit of a bargain for you if you can get him. But Robinson, to me, he's fit in a three-headed backfield. And that's part of the problem is that, I like his physicality. I like that he can catch. I think he's a smart running back. But do I think that Gibson could possibly shut the door on Robinson and then disappoint everybody who had their sights set high on Robinson? I think that can happen. And also with McKissick and what he does, there's just too many irons in the fire there with that backfield. And that's the same thing right now when you look at Ty Davis Price. I like his skills. I was a little shocked at first when I saw how fast he ran. And then I went back and looked and I'm like, okay, it's there. I just didn't. It's hard to gauge speed sometimes. So I get it. I think he has some real potential as a pass protector. But to me, I joke that like Kyle Shanahan is like, if you've ever watched, The Devil Wears Prada, especially since both of you guys are married, I imagine that you have. If you ever watched that, to me, Kyle Shanahan is Meryl Streep's character of the NFL. He is that type of person when it comes to personnel. And you just never know. I mean, Brandon Ayuk's in the doghouse again. George Kittle was in the doghouse. He said early in his second year. Trey Sermon was in the doghouse before that. Dante Pettis was in the doghouse. It's just like nobody makes Kyle Shanahan happy. It's like Kyle Shanahan has this idea of what he wants, and it's like, well, what do you want? Do you want a great flanker or a great slot receiver? Or, do you want a guy who can like win in these different areas? And he's like, I want everything. And if I don't get it tomorrow, then I'd rather pick a yes man in Mohamed Sanu, who's like a terrific football player overall in terms of being a veteran, but not a guy that everybody on the roster in the locker room is going to go, that guy's an athletic stud again, at this stage of his career, and he's going to be a difference maker. Whereas some of these guys who may not do everything right that Kyle wanted on his video game scheme, but actually can make plays, that's the thing. So I look at a guy like Tyrion Davis Price, and I just wonder what's going to happen there. Like, to me, it's like until Kyle Shanahan moves to another team or gets fired or whatever happens there, I just pick up the cheapest guy who possibly could take over if an injury strike and he just gets the volume. So for Dynasty, if you can get him in the late round, great. And you just hold on to him. But I wouldn't go nuts trying to hold on to him. In fact, as soon as he starts to pop, trade his ass, because that's the best deal you're going to get a recoup on investment, and you don't know what's going to happen that next time. So, for me, Davis Price is one of those guys. And then I would think, Bam Knight, I like Zonovan Knight, love his game, hate the landing spot, think it's awful, just because the Jets value runners with speed to attack the creases early and hard. They want these quick, fast guys. They want to be San Francisco East, but they don't have San Francisco's offensive line. So maybe Bam gets in there because all the other guys get banged up, getting hit in the backfield or blowing out, knees because they've got to try and elude somebody, basically in their lap by the time they're taking the exchange. And they need a guy who can actually hit a crease hard and just be focused and run through contact. And he's a very good route runner. Actually, he's an underrated route runner. Bam Knight, to me, Bam Knight and Trey Sermon, the two guys who are just bad fits in their offenses overall. If the Pittsburgh Steelers need a running back, they need to shop for these two and put them in their stable, and they will wind up with great redundancy for Najee Harris, who could, and either of those backs could deliver fantasy production for you if Najee Harris went down. So I'm just saying, if you have either of those backs and you got them late or you got Sermon early, thanks to someone I know, I don't know, then your best hope is to wait that they get cut and wind up at a team that's a better fit for them, and they could earn a better role.
Yeah, I think you bring up some really interesting points there. And, if San Francisco's out on Sermon as much as it might seem, he might be a guy that could be very readily had. They might say, we'll take a 7th round pick, or we'll take a conditional 6th round pick or something,
Yeah.
if they're ready to move on with obviously Elijah Mitchell and Mostert and Jeff Wilson.
And Jordan Mason.
Yeah, I mean,
Jordan Mason is another one. I'm sorry. Can I just mention him real quick?
Yeah.
Out of Georgia Tech, he's a 220. He can catch. He can pass protect, and he has more burst than you would think. He is a skilled running back who they think he might make the roster, and if he does, he's going to make it over Trey Sermon because they're done with Trey Sermon. I think you're right.
Yeah, and that means he probably could be had very much on the cheap. One guy that we didn't get a chance to talk about right there, and then this will be the last one for running back talk, is do you think Josh McDaniels and the New England people that are now running Vegas, do you think they look at a guy like Zamir White, who obviously right now, Josh Jacobs, Kenyon Drake there? My guess is neither of those two are on their roster, by the start of the following season. Do you think they look at a guy like Zamir White and think that he could play a role similar to what they saw in New England last year with a guy like Ramondre Stevenson? Do you see any similarities between a guy like Stevenson and Zamir White? I'm drawing a blank on where you were on Ramondre Stevenson last year.
Sure.
But maybe just talk a little bit about Zamir White, and maybe if you think the Raiders envision him as being part of that backfield, maybe not this year, maybe a little bit here or there, but definitely more year 2.
It's such a tough situation because you hear Charles Robinson of Yahoo, who's the national sports writer, talk about how, well, it's going to be like New England, so just avert your eyes, And then I think, well, Damien Harris was a top 10 back last year. And a lot of that had to do with that you had a young back in Ramondre Stevenson, who I liked a lot coming out. I thought he was a terrific receiver. Reminded me of LeGarrette Blount in a lot of ways. So, and I've always been a LeGarrette Blount fan. So, maybe not unbelievably quick twitch, but fast enough, good route runner, good pass protector, powerful, can run through you, but can also run around you a little bit. But he still had things to learn. And then you look at the rest of that roster, and there wasn't much there at the running back position. I mean, Sony Michel got traded, and but they were done with him because he's always banged up, so they were kind of done with that. Well, you look at this team in Las Vegas, and yeah, Kenyon Drake could be good if you give him enough touches, and he's healthy enough. And you give him the right kind of touches. He's not a good all-around back still, but he's a speedster who you can get into space. He does great. You can give him certain types of runs that simulate space, and he does well there too. But then after that, you've got Brandon Bolden, who's there to basically transition the running back room to the offensive scheme, and a great special teams guy and kind of a running back coach on the field for you. You've got Amir Abdullah, who is a good pass catcher, but never really turned into the runner that he could become. And is a guy that I really liked, but just really didn't work out. And he's not unbelievably explosive. So Zamir White, you look at White in this situation, and I don't think he's Ramondre Stevenson in the fact that Stevenson is like a way better pass catcher at this stage of his career and a better pass protector. Whereas White is a try-hard guy in those areas, but not quite there. He has some things to learn. He might learn fast. He's also not, he plays, you look at his tape and you think he's 220 the way he runs. But then when you find out that he's not even 210, I mean, I'm laughing because I'm joking. I've been working on trying to get in shape, and I've gone from Ramondre Stevenson JUCO weight to actually now like Reggie Bush, like pre-workout, weight. Now I'm at Zamir White weight, which is like under 210, which means you don't qualify to be an every down back anymore. So he's like, he's at that level, and you just wonder how that's going to translate to the NFL, because it's not like he's running behind the NFL equivalent of Georgia's offensive line, and he's not. But he's still running behind the equivalent of like the SEC defenses he's facing, but now every week, and all the guys now playing at an NFL level. So I'm a little leery about the Zamir White love. I love that. I think he's a fan favorite of the media because he's quotable. He's a nice guy. He's known as a leader. And when you don't watch tape, but you quote people a lot, you tend to glom on to guys like Zamir White because he's because of all the things I just said. I think he can be a good player, but come on. I know that Josh Jacobs gets hurt a lot, but he's a good running back. So to me, Josh Jacobs is still Damien Harris in this offense. Just maybe you have to scale it back a little bit in terms of the TD department and the touch department, because they're going to have to throw the ball a lot, and they have the weapons to throw it. Unlike what Mac Jones had last year, which was a bunch of, journeyman guys who can be pretty good, and then your run game with a decent offensive line. This is more like Tom Brady. This is more of the offense that Josh McDaniels had when he had Tom Brady. And here's the other thing about Josh McDaniels I want to add. Last time he was a part of drafting running backs, I don't remember that working out so well. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have a good eye for it, but Knowshon Marino, I think, was one of the guys who was pretty good, but never quite like Knowshon Marino. You would have heard, when you heard about Knowshon Marino and the way he played, the hype on him was like he was Saquon Barkley in terms of the hype they gave to him, maybe without the speed element. But that's the thing. He wasn't quite as big as you thought he was going to be. He wasn't quite as electric as he could be. And I'm trying to remember, I think Monty Ball might have been in that mix too, if I remember correctly.
I know he played there, but I don't know if he was drafted or not.
He might not have been drafted there, but he was there. I don't know. I look at those, and I may be stretching here and just like pinning too much blame on Josh McDaniel on some of these guys. But if I'm right about that, that's a layer that would be one to keep an eye on. Again, it's a minor layer that may not mean anything, but it's still worth keeping an eye on.
I think, one of the other things, just to, probably explain why people are more excited about Zamir White than, even a guy like Brian Robinson. You see Zamir White going, ahead of some of these wide receivers we're about to talk about. But, he came in highly recruited and a Debbie Darling, right? And, he lost a little bit of the luster after the ACLs, but he's got that name. He's got Zeus, right? That's his nickname. And, that makes you think he's 240 as well, right? But so I think you've kind of got a little bit of I would say a perception issue, but maybe he's just got like a really great marketing team, right?
Maybe, and he is a good back. Like, I like his downhill style. He's very smart in terms of how he picks creases. I think he can be a good pass protector. But again, when I hear Zeus and then I see the size that he is, and he might be more Hercules than Zeus, that still might be good, but you're a little underwhelmed, and, especially if you know your myths. So that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely got the Georgia boost, the SEC boost. He's got a lot of things there that are kind of pushing him up. And, I think as we talked about a lot of these guys who went late day 2, early day 3, they can become functional role players at the NFL. And I think that's probably where they're ticketed. And I think it's probably stretching to think that these guys are going to really materialize to focal points of an offense, bell cows, even though that's kind of a dying word in the NFL right now. I think that's, and that kind of speaks of this class as, we knew it was top heavy. We knew there was Breece Hall. We knew there was Kenneth Walker. And then I think it was kind of like pick your next flavor that you happen to like. One person might like this guy, somebody else. You could ask 10 different people, and there might have been 10 different answers on the next guy or two that somebody, personally liked. And I think even now post-draft, we're kind of still seeing it's very much, these guys are going to have a role. They could be functional players, but their ceiling is somewhat capped, somewhat limited. They're not a guy who's probably they're probably not players who are going to force the hand a year from now in terms of NFL teams and decision makers saying, we don't need somebody because we drafted this guy the year before in round 4.
Yeah, no durable Raheem Mosterts, most likely. And if there's a few that it could happen to, But like to me, the best shot is maybe Kennedy Brooks or Isaiah Pacheco or Zaquandre White. But again, the offenses they're in, you look at all those combinations, and it's like it's still unlikely.
Yeah, and just to go back, we had talked about it before. Austin Eckler's only signed through 2023, so he's got this year and next year. And if they were to, for whatever reason, choose to move on from him, he only has a $1 million cap hit the following year. So the Chargers aren't committed. This isn't like the Cowboys being stuck with Ezekiel Elliott, last year, this year, maybe even another year after this. The Chargers, there's an opportunity there if Spiller was able to seize the moment or Eckler was to get hurt,
and
or something.
He's our last example of that UDFA who's made good on that level.
Yeah, Eckler. Yeah. And I mean, even if they do somehow, waltz their way into this role, I mean, we looked at Michael Carter again, right? It's just more than likely not that they are what they are. They fit. They're really, I think they're very great NFL selections in that range as very talented backs that fit what coaches are looking for. They're going to fill a role that they have in mind, what they're going to ask them to do. And that's from a fantasy lens, not going to be the most valuable role. And even if they inherit, Eckler gets cut, that doesn't mean you better be on the lookout that Spiller's going to have a running mate, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they're not going to look into him as being the only guy. So let's transition this over to wide receivers. And Matt, last time I was with you, it was opening night of the draft. I was joining you and Sig over at Football Guys. I think I was on for like the first eight picks or so. And it was a lot of defensive players and offensive linemen. The minute I got off the air, it was wide receiver explosion for the next hour. 6 wide receivers go off the board within the first 17 picks. Fast and furious after the early start there with the defensive players and the couple offensive linemen. And really, two-part question really with those first-round wide receivers. Is there one or two that you really like the fit, landing spot, opportunity that exists for them, the way you watch them play film and evaluate them in terms of their college film and what they could do at the next level, and they're in the perfect spot? And then the other first round question is, when we had you on pre-draft, you brought up some concerns or questions you had about Treylon Burks and him transitioning to the NFL. Do you think now him being in Tennessee, probably a lot of pressure to replace A.J. Brown, which they traded on draft night as well, how do you think he fits there on a team that very run heavy, very play action heavy? Do you think it's a good landing spot for Treylon Burks and maybe minimizes what they ask him to do early? Or do you still have concerns about that transition for Burks as well?
Yeah, those are all great questions. I mean, the guy who jumps off to me, and I talked about him with Russ Landy on my podcast last week, was Chris Olave. I just, he was my favorite receiver in this class. It was fun to hear that Russ felt the same way. We hadn't talked about it. We spent a lot of time talking about quarterbacks during the offseason, but we didn't even mention receivers. And so it was fun to hear him say the same thing, which is, I think he's one of the best route runners in this class. I think he can make an immediate impact. Obviously, the longer Michael Thomas is having issues being able to get back into the swing of things, the more Olave might be a factor early. He reminds me of a guy like Chad Johnson in terms of that he can play inside, outside for you. He could probably play all 3 positions for you. He's a very smooth route runner, great tracker of the football, skilled after the catch in terms of just smarts. So I think, 2 years ago, our space overanalyzed Justin Jefferson because he was joining the club of a run-oriented offense that had a top receiving option already in Adam Thielen. I thought Jefferson was going to be the best fantasy play. And a year before that, I think it was a year before, it was A.J. Brown. And I thought A.J. Brown was going to be a great fit in Tennessee, but everybody was like, ground game, Corey Davis. A.J. Brown's just a one-trick pony who was second banana to DK Metcalf, when really it was kind of, DK Metcalf's a little bit, I like Metcalf, but he's a little less multi-dimensional than A.J. Brown is. So, you look at the scenario and I see Olave, and he lands on a team with a fellow alum who is a go-getter, hard-driving football 24/7 and probably eating up the opportunity to want to get on the field. And if he can't, he's probably going to want to be there to help his fellow alum along, in Michael Thomas. You have one of the best locker room people in Jarvis Landry, who is also an unbelievably skilled zone receiver who runs great routes. And both those veterans are going to be there working with Chris Olave, who's already pretty darn polished. So if you're already polished enough that you can separate from defenders, you can run good routes, and you have those advanced skills, what else are you going to learn from these two guys? You're going to learn advanced concepts that often takes 2 to 3 years for some of these other receivers to even scratch the surface on. So to me, Olave has a really good chance. And with Jameis Winston, listen, Winston improved while he was there last year. Like the footwork that he worked on, it was notably better. Now, it didn't show up in the production department for him, and he got hurt, but he looked a lot better. Some of the dumb mistakes that he often made because his feet were operating like 2 steps behind the rest of his body, and he always seemed out of alignment and was late with throws and off target with certain throws, and then he'd try and force situations. He wasn't doing that nearly as often as in New Orleans last year for the limited time he played. So I'm kind of low-key excited to see what Winston can do, and I think he's a bit of a sleeper this year. So I think Olave can be that kind of Chris Godwin type of player, early Chris Godwin, maybe not peak Chris Godwin, but an early Chris Godwin kind of version for Jameis Winston. He's got a similar player who can be that guy. So that's a guy that I love to fit. I think Christian Watson may not this year, but I'm a fan of what Watson can do. I'm a fan of that he has an understanding of the basics of a West Coast offense. He just has to have it ramped up more, learning to read coverages, pre-snap, post-snap type of stuff that you got to be on the same page with Aaron Rodgers. And any top quarterback is demanding of that. We always talk about Aaron Rodgers as if he's this diva who's awful person. And at least my buddy Sigmund Bloom does, because he low-key hates Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson and these guys who are actually seem cool on the surface. And, Bloom's one of these cool school kids. So he doesn't like I don't think he likes the competition, as I bust on my buddy there. But, you look at Peyton Manning, and Peyton Manning used to ream Demaryius Thomas, may he rest in peace, a new one. The first couple of years he was, they were working together, and he was very demanding of his receivers of where they needed to be. Watson is going to go through some of that, but he's needed. And I think as long as he's mature enough to handle the experience, I think by 2023, he can give you what Javon Walker was supposed to give the Green Bay Packers after that first season that was unbelievable for him. And then the rails fell off his game and unfortunately some of the things in his personal life too. So I like Watson. Alec Pierce, he gets a great opportunity with a veteran in Matt Ryan, who may not be, what the Athletics, Mike Sando's quarterback tiers apparently rated him a tier 3 quarterback due to age, which is fine, whatever. Maybe that's what the execs think. But Matt Ryan is going to win a playoff game this year when they get into the playoffs. And he's going to beat one of the teams with one of the tier 1 quarterbacks probably in it, either Buffalo or Kansas City, because they can run the football. He may not be a great red zone quarterback, but he's great in the pocket, and they make a great pocket in Indianapolis. Better one than what any of these other teams in the AFC have, maybe outside of Cleveland. And I would say Colts are better at it. And when you look at Michael Pittman, he's a good receiver, but is he the dynamic number one you put against the number one cornerback to get off press and win with moves or with physicality more off play action? So there's a little bit of a limitation to me in Michael Pittman's game. I think he's a very good receiver, but I don't see Michael Evans and even Mike, Mike, I see him more as he runs a lot of overs and crossing routes and play action deep routes, but he's not like, it's 3rd and 17. We need you to run that deep comeback and beat that top corner and win. And I don't think he does that. I think Alec Pierce, has a little bit more opportunity as a result of that to give you some of that skill in the deep game, and some of the vertical shots. I think he has more of that. Whereas Pittman, I think, can be slightly better after the catch. Pierce is just as good at the catch point And I think that they're trying to feed him to be able to run some routes that maybe Pittman is okay at, but not great at. But at the same time, is he a guy that's going to give you 700 to 900 yards or 1,000 to 1,200 yards? And I think he's more in that 700 to 900 yard range for the next 2 years. It depends on Paris Campbell. If Paris Campbell takes off and plays as well as he in the real games as he is in practices, then Paris Campbell could be that Calvin Ridley type of player or the lead player in this offense, whereas Pierce and Pittman are kind of like, none of these players, none of these Colts receivers strike me to be anything like the next Julio Jones or Roddy White. They're more Calvin Ridley depending on somebody else. And even then, they're not 1,300 yard Calvin Ridley. They're more 800 to 1,000 yard Calvin Ridley. So those guys fit, kind of suit me there. I love David Bell. I just think he's in the perfect situation for what that offense wants him to do. He's gonna give you like kind of a mix of Jarvis Landry and DeAndre Hopkins in that sense. But is he going to be 137 target, 1,100 yard Jarvis Landry? Not this year. I think he's going to be more like 60 to 80 target Jarvis Landry and 700 to 900 yards at best, depending on how well he meshes with not with Teddy Bridgewater, with Jacoby Brissett, and whatever amount we get out of Deshaun Watson. And then you talk about Treylon Burks, and you look at Burks, and I think it's a good fit for him long term to be, in terms of this offense. I think it's a good fit, but there's some high risk reward with his game. And so, right now, when you look at this team, and let me see if I can kind of find what I was thinking, some of my thoughts that I wanted to share, because I had a couple of notes on him that I thought were worthwhile. But, I think the thing with Burks in terms of, in terms of his skills, he still needs to learn how to run zone routes better. And that's where they're going to try and use him, is in space or off play action. So can he defeat press coverage? Not really. Not at this stage yet. He's physical enough, but he's just not skilled enough unless he learns fast. He's not going to settle into open zones well for Ryan Tannehill as well as he needs to. That might improve too, but he forced his quarterback to run more often than they should have. And the open spaces are not going to be as open. It's nice that he outran the Alabama defense, but I'm sorry if you took the Alabama defense right now that played last year, even the guys who are in the NFL camp, put them together and put them against, let's think of like the team that's in the worst shape right now, whatever that is, whatever team you think is the worst team in the NFL, and that Alabama defense is going to get 35 posted on them easy. Okay. And I just think that means that the worst linebackers in the flat, or the worst safeties in the flat, Treylon Burks may get 1 out of every 5 of those opportunities for positive yards when they try and open him up in the space. And he might break 1 or 2 of them this year, but he's not going to be the guy that people look at on the college highlight tape. I think, he's a player that when I look at him from a projection standpoint this year, I have Treylon Burks at about 584 yards, 70 targets, 42 catches, 3 touchdowns, and 1 touchdown rushing, with like maybe close to 40 yards rushing on 5 attempts. Basically a combined 640, 650 yards, which I think is pretty good. But I just don't think it's, we're not looking at Devonta Smith as like, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 territory for people this year. And there's a real bottom to his game where like they might have to use him like Kelvin Benjamin, was being used. But the difference being is that they might not be able to protect him as well. They might not have the caliber of quarterback, and they don't. And back in Kelvin Benjamin's day, you could throw fade routes and let him win those. Where fade routes don't win anymore in the NFL. That's gone the way of Kelvin Benjamin, for that 1 year that he was really good. And then the rest of the time he kind of got discovered. And I wonder if Treylon Burks, if he can't improve his game, is just a faster Kelvin Benjamin.
Yeah, I mean, one I find it very fascinating too, because one thing Paul talks about a lot, being a big AJ Brown fan, to begin with too, is that AJ Brown was an AJ Brown and he had to develop through that path. And as we say often, development isn't linear, right? AJ Brown hit the ground running. I personally think that if Treylon Burks is going to do that, I think he's got a little bit of time when you put in zone beaters like Robert Woods and Austin Hooper in there, right? And what does a patient path for Tennessee look like to bring Treylon Burks along? I mean, very much schemed out looks, even if that's, certain jet sweeps and sort of ISO looks, just to get him to beat those linebackers, right? You find that mismatch and you get him a couple targets a game. I don't think your projections are that crazy, but it's you look around a bunch of other places and I think the only other person who, people project a higher opportunity is Drake London. So maybe let's, I think it's a very interesting note to leave Treylon Burks and kind of mull that over and maybe just kind of switch over to, Drake London right now. And like, is his opportunity as good as we think it is as well? 130 targets and 1,000 yards, or do we need to be a little bit more tempered as well with maybe a more conservative offense in Atlanta?
I would be tempered with it just because do we really trust Marcus Mariota? And then Desmond Ridder to me is, I just don't believe in his game. I just don't think he is an NFL starting quarterback. I don't think he's going to develop into one. I hope I'm proven wrong, but I don't see that happening. And the fact that Mariota is a good ways ahead of him is telling. I look at Drake London in this offense, and I think you have an 1,100-yard receiver in Kyle Pitts, and then you look at London, and it's really going to be between London, Cordero Patterson, and Bryan Edwards as your like second, third, and fourth targets. And I wouldn't be surprised if, Patterson has upwards of 70 to 75 targets, 52, maybe I'm at about 50 catches, close to 600 yards, about 11 yards per catch, 6 touchdowns. I look at London, and I have him at 85 targets, which I think is great for a rookie. But 130, yeah, I can't even imagine him getting that many. That's the idea of people looking at a spreadsheet and saying there's a void to fill, and we need to fill that void. And it's kind of like, well, look at the Titans offense, look at the quality of and compared to Atlanta's offense when Arthur Smith was in play, and then look at also like the quality of the offensive line, which I don't think is all that great. I think Atlanta might be the worst team in the league. And when I look at least the worst offense, and the defense I don't think is anything special by any stretch of the imagination either. So London, 85 targets, 50 catches, 700 yards, 4 touchdowns. That's kind of where I have him. I like his skills. I think that he could be a slightly better Michael Pittman at some point in his game in terms of what he does all around. Now, whether the fit and the team surrounding talent is good enough for London to be a better producer than Michael Pittman, I think that's the real question. But to me, London and Bryan Edwards is a guy too that they may have to rely on enough that that London and Edwards to me might combine for 140 to 150 targets, but I don't think that either one of them is going to generate that. I think Pitts is going to be your target leader with somewhere around 120, and then the rest of these guys are going to be splitting between 70 to 80 that I mentioned, and then you have like probably guys like Damier Byrd and Auden Tate and Olamide Zaccheaus and Cameron Batson getting somewhere between 20 to 40 targets apiece, in addition to maybe a Damian Williams. I think that this To me, none of these guys scream, especially first year with the quarterback that they have. None of them scream to me like mismatch against primary corners in this league. Have always liked Brian Edwards, and I think that there's a little bit more there for him to develop. But on this team, in this environment with these quarterbacks and coaching staff, I'm not sold on that.
Yeah, 9 times out of 10, it's just the answer is spread them around, unless you just see some transcendent breakout coming. But that still posts 35 on Alabama's defense.
Well, yeah, I mean, Brian, if he played Alabama every week, Brian Edwards would be a 1,600-yard receiver at this stage.
Yeah, and I think people, you kind of said it best there with when you're just trying to predict the game from a spreadsheet perspective, and there's this giant void. It's easy to say, oh, the new guy, the first round pick, the top 10 pick, the top 15 pick, the top 20 pick. Oh, just pencil them in for 15% of the targets. But that's not taking into account just how hard the transition is, hence our name from Saturday to Sunday, and I do think sometimes it's very easy to fall into a trap when we do see transcendent talents, right? Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, the inherent connection that even Tua had with Jalen Waddle last year playing together in college, Jamar Chase playing with his quarterback, who's a high-level quarterback in the NFL, and Joe Burrow, just because they went out and put up these maybe Jamar Chase, but these elite numbers and elite target shares and opportunities, it doesn't mean the following year there's going to be another handful of rookies that automatically do that as well. 130 targets, 120 targets. I don't think anybody is mistakenly thinking that the top of this wide receiver year was at the same level as Jamar Chase. And so it's not at every year apples to apples comparison. And I think sometimes when we are just trying to look at when people are just filling out spreadsheets and percentages, it's easy to overinflate wide receiver numbers. And we have had some really great rookie wide receiver years lately, more than we used to have in the past. It's still, I think, dangerous to just start penciling in big numbers for rookies. And we're seeing that. If you look around the industry, Treylon Burks, Drake London, you're seeing really high projections in year one. And I'm not sure either of those guys are guys who warrant that just based on where they went, like Matt was saying, and the development that is needed from some of these guys. They're not very refined players in some aspects. So I think that tempered outlook is probably the safer way to play, even though people want that initial explosion, like Jamar Chase, like Jalen Waddle. So it'll be interesting to kind of see the ebbs and flows. And if this rookie class is a little bit on the downside, does that change people's perspective next year in terms of what we think about those guys? I think that's something to kind of follow closely. And it kind of ties into transition over to quarterbacks, because forever we have seen quarterbacks get pushed up the board, whether it's based on one singular trait, whether it's arm talent, whether it's athleticism or something. But this year, the only quarterback that got pushed into round one was Kenny Pickett. Do you think, Matt, that this is a 1 year blip on the radar? People were down on this class, or do you think, is it possible that teams watching that game last year, Mahomes and Josh Allen, and how good Joe Burrow was in the playoffs and how good Matt Stafford was, are teams going to start? Do we think this might be the start of them being smarter with their process of not pushing up quarterbacks that don't deserve to be pushed up? Or do you think it's just a 1 year thing that this particular class, there was more question marks than usual, therefore they let them fall?
I'll believe it when I see it, because I think it was the latter. I think that this particular class had a lot of question marks to it. And so as a result of that, the lack of certainty about any of these guys really pushed them down the boards. And so, I'm glad to see it, and this year, I mean, I've probably watched about 30 running backs already, but I've only watched about 4 or 5 of the quarterbacks, and that was mostly from last year. So I've got more of those guys to watch, and I tend to like to watch them last. But from what I'm seeing, some of the holdovers that people are talking about and some of the ones that I saw, I wasn't unbelievably impressed with either. So I'm just waiting to see. I've got a lot more to watch, but obviously if some of the underclassmen come out, they might be interesting and might be worthwhile. But yeah, I that's probably the best way that I could put it, is I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best perspective, right? Because I was with you on air when the Giants pushed up Daniel Jones, and we've seen, if you go back even further, the draft class with Ponder and Lockett and so many other
Drew
ones.
Lock and Baker
Yeah,
Mayfield,
exactly.
and Mitchell Trubisky, and
the list. There's way more evidence on that side of teams pushing up guys than there is of teams playing it smart and realizing he's not the guy who's got minimal flaws that warrants going in the top 10 or top 5 or even in round 1. And until we see more years of maybe what we just saw, I think that's probably the approach that next year there's probably going to be teams that are really gung-ho about trying to get their quarterback, especially if they passed on it this past year, that we're probably right back to teams pushing quarterbacks high up the board. From the guys that fell, is there any of those round 3 guys that intrigue you that you can say maybe in a couple of years one develops to be above average starting quarterback? Or do you kind of just see those guys probably settling as backups from that Desmond Ridder, Matt Corral, Malik Willis group, who kind of all went there pretty close together to each other in round 3? Do you think there's one from that group based on where they went that maybe they can become something down the line?
Matt Corral. I like Matt Corral. I thought to me, the quarterback position, and I often hear, I heard today there's a guy by the name of Honest NFL who's a former scout on Twitter, and I think he's a former Eagles scout, and he's a fun guy to listen to, and he certainly has, there's a lot of things he's talked about that I go, and I'm joking when I say this, but does he read my blog? Because I've been saying this for years, but it's like, obviously he doesn't, and he's learned stuff. He's had his own conclusions from being a scout for a long time. Now, one of the things that he'll talk about is he gets tired of seeing scouting reports or stuff that kind of nitpick players or nitpick what they can or can't do. And part of that is, I think there's 2 things with that. If I look at it from the thing that I believe, the genuine kind of thing that I believe from him, is that he's trying to explain to people how scouts do what scouts do in the NFL, which is, where players win. And you got to do that when you scout players. It's very important, because no player is perfect, and finding the match. But the other thing that I would say, that I would joke, if the cynical side of me were to take over, the mean heel side of me would take over, would be like, well, you're also you're also know that you're on social media and you might want a job again in the NFL. And you know that it's hard to get a job again in the NFL. And you don't want to be nitpicking players that teams have already drafted and saying bad things about them. You want to be defending, all these teams on what they do. So sometimes frame of reference is important. And there may be a little bit of that there. Either way, I respect the guy for the work that he does. I'm just saying that it's worthwhile kind of looking. And even if you look at it and say, well, maybe he's not doing that. But the point of being is that when you look at a guy like all these other players, and you look at like Corral, he's someone that I think has the most skills that are hard to teach. He processes the game very fast. It doesn't mean he always makes the best decisions, but the decisions that he makes against pressure, off script, reading defense pre-snap, there's things he does that I think will be hard to teach the other players in his peer group to do. And I think that, I don't believe Baker Mayfield's going to succeed. I don't believe Sam Darnold is going to succeed. So when the dust settles, when those 2 fail out, I think you're going to see Matt Corral get his opportunity as long as he proves that he's a worker, and works at his craft. To me, there's more upside to his game. And you look at Malik Willis, he has the highest upside, but he's also the guy that has the most to learn. And I think he'll benefit from packages, and you may get the modern day version of Cordell Stewart kind of work with him, the way the Steelers used Cordell Stewart way back in the day. You might get a little bit of that with Malik Willis early on in his career, and then hope that he can become an every down quarterback. And maybe that'll happen for him. He seems to be a great kid. But I think that it's hard to project him on the skills level as a passer and a decision maker in the way that I can with Corral.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll say, when I watched Corral, I thought there were glimpses, not the same, but I thought there were glimpses of some Tony Romo in his game, and just in terms of certain styles, certain ways he played the game, the way he was able to make some things happen, and he was one of my favorite quarterbacks in this class. And, it's going to be interesting there. And obviously Baker's going to get the opportunity this year, but Darnold's going to be gone after this year. Baker, if he doesn't succeed this year, he's going to be gone. It's going to be a whole new regime, probably a whole new coaching staff. GM might survive.
And they might just draft somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah. And they might bring someone else in. But Corral is a guy who I'm interested in kind of seeing his development and see if he's willing to, like you said, work at that craft, right? There's been some questions about some things that, again, we really are not privy to knowing, some of the inside stuff that goes on in terms of interviewing coaches and what goes on inside meetings and stuff like that. But I do like the skill set of Corral. He intrigues me a lot from that group. I do think it's funny that some of these guys fell to where they did fall when we see other guys who have went higher than them, even last year, right? If you just talk about traits like Kyle Trask and Kellen Mond went higher than some of these guys like Corral. It seems like it was a little bit of an overcorrection, which was kind of interesting to kind of see that happen. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see if this quarterback class, and I have my reservations about Kenny Pickett and how good he's going to be in Pittsburgh. And, we'll see how quickly he even gets on the football field. I know we had talked about him pre-draft with you as well. Jeff, any final questions for Matt here before we close it out tonight?
Yeah, one quick one, because you mentioned Kenny Pickett and, maybe not even getting on the field quickly. If you hear the camp buzz, right, it's going to be Mitchell Trubisky beating him out for the job. But I guess, we've talked about this before, Matt, where, sitting is not the worst thing for a quarterback, no matter how much a fan base clamors for first round picks. But a good conversation we had with Sig the other week was about the stability of organizations and, how that helps players grow. And does that factor in at all in your mind? When you talk about a potentially chaotic Carolina Panthers team and who knows what their future holds versus, a organization like the Steelers who, just seem year in and year out to be putting together a good product.
Yeah. And I think it does fall into play. But you look at situations and say, well, who's going to, where is the quarterback situation, or how long has Mike Tomlin been there? How long is he going to be there? And so you can have questions about those types of things. But at this point, when you're talking about third round quarterbacks versus first round guys, I mean, obviously, Matt Corral's going to have a bigger risk reward factor than Pickett. So it's not even a comparison, I think, with those guys. Now, the team where I think where that could factor in is a guy that's a favorite of mine is Skyler Thompson, who had a good camp thus far, or at least has shown up pretty well in minicamp with the Miami Dolphins, who reminded me a little bit of a Tony Romo. That's the guy I compared him to pre-draft. And, he was drafted in the 7th round. Teddy Bridgewater's, a journeyman. He's a journeyman starter who's a veteran who can be helpful. The only guy that this new regime in Miami drafted, and the new regime's going to be in place if Mike McDaniel can show that he can build something from there. we might, that's the type of thing you can factor in, because Tua is an improve it year. This is, we've given you all the weapons you could possibly want in skill positions. And unless the offensive line is so bad that Mike McDaniel can't find a way to blame Tua for that, Tua's got to sink or swim. And if he doesn't, well, the only guy he has might give if Tua fails drastically by midseason, we might see the Davis Mills treatment out of Skyler Thompson and see what he has. Why not? Especially with these young guys now. Would Tyreek Hill fake an injury, or get advice from his agent on faking something or doing something crazy so that he doesn't have to be play through all that with a rookie? I don't know. Diva wide receivers are interesting that way. I don't know if he's a diva, but the fact that he's saying that Tua is better than Patrick Mahomes in certain facets of the game, kind of stinks of agent speak, if you ask me. So that you might not get that full, you might not get that full bed of surrounding talent for a guy like Thompson in this regard. But I think that he's someone that is interesting to watch, because he could build with an organization and with a guy who's witnessed undrafted players work out, and Mike McDaniel working behind Kyle Shanahan and seeing how that sometimes can and work out well. And especially if the guy seems to be a hard worker and is already like working with Dan Marino and is like, there are guys like Drew Lock who had an opportunity with Peyton Manning early on and just blew it off until his job was threatened. And with Teddy Bridgewater, and was like, oh, now I want to contact Peyton after Peyton said, anything you need. Peyton Manning, if I was a young quarterback and Peyton Manning or Dan Marino said, anything you need, let me know. And I go, do you have a garage? And he'd say, why? I said, because I will pay rent to live there and work with you whenever you have the opportunity. I just need a mattress and a hot plate and some and maybe some barbells, and a bench press. That's all and obviously
Video.
a DVD player.
Yeah.
That's but I figure we'll be watching it with you in the living room, I figured at that point, or wherever you take me. But I just need that. I will stay here for the first 2 to 3 years if I need to. I will pay premium rent just to stay in these crappy conditions to do that. And I think Skyler Thompson gets that. There's some guys who didn't. And so that's why that's fascinating to me.
Well, you mentioned the track record of the 49ers UDFA quarterbacks. Nick Mullins got starts over CJ Beathard, who's, was their 3rd round pick. And they did pretty well. And I think, as you mentioned, Skyler Thompson has, I think, a much higher base of talent than a guy like Nick Mullins out there. So obviously that was an injury, but we'll have to really pay attention to the roster decisions, right? That when they go down to 53, what happens, right? Do they carry a third? I don't see them cutting Teddy Bridgewater, but do they carry a third quarterback, right?
That's a good question.
And San Francisco did that a couple of years ago with Beathard and Mullins. They carried 3 quarterbacks into the year because they didn't want to let them go. So that'll give us an indication.
Yeah. And with that bad offensive line, they may need it.
Yeah. And if the draft tells us anything, those 7th round picks, when the teams make a pick in the 7th round, they are making that pick because they know, I think at times they're making that pick because they know that person is going to be a hot commodity as a UDFA, and they are trying to get almost like jump the gun. Because let's be honest, a lot of 6th and 7th round guys probably are similar in skill and talent in most evaluators' eyes as the UDFAs, but they want to get a guy to be like, no, we don't want to fight for him on the UDFA. We don't want our, people, our scouts and stuff calling them saying, we'll offer this signing bonus, we'll offer that. They invested in him. If they try to sneak him on the practice squad, it's almost like opening up that door again, almost like the UDFA period. So I'm thinking that Miami is probably going to go the 3 quarterback route, because if not, yes, I know a team, if they want to take him, they got to put him on their active roster. But there are plenty of teams in the NFL that are open to keeping 3 quarterbacks. And if he was a guy that maybe they were thinking about a team was thinking about trying to get him as a UDFA, and he would have been one of those initial phone calls, or maybe he probably spoke to teams and during the latter stages of the draft, because teams say they start calling guys and be like, if you don't get picked in the 7th round, we're interested. I think he's probably going to find his way on the roster. And then once he's there, let's see how the chips fall there. And like you said, he's the only one attached to this new regime. So especially new coaching staff. So it's going to be interesting to kind of follow that. Matt, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for being willing to go live with us here on YouTube and for people to watch us. Always a pleasure to talk to you. It's always really fun, pre-draft, post-draft, joining you and Sig on draft night. I always look forward to any opportunity to get a chance to discuss football with you, these prospects. Please, I'm sure all of our audience is following you, but if there's anything you're working on over, at the RSP film room or at the website or anything else you want to share, please do so right now.
Okay. So the biggest thing is that this is the second year I'm doing projections, dynasty rankings and projections for the for a 2-year period, for each of those players. So it's a year-long subscription, but you get like basically a look at this year plus an early look at next year. And I do a win now and a long build ranking that's tiered rankings, color coded, much like the RSP post draft, but for all the players. And I provide projections sorted by team. There's a PDF version of it, but starting in August, I'm making the Excel sheet available. So if you want the Excel sheet so that you can sort, change things, edit anything you want, that's great. And as I go with that, I will probably be adding more and more notes to those players individually, because I can do that on Excel. And the more people who get the Excel, the less likely I'll continue doing the PDF, because it's just unnecessary work at that stage. But you can get it for $24.95 at mattwaldman.com. And the response has been great thus far with it, but again, it's a fairly new product, and I've gotten a good response about folks wanting the spreadsheet. So if you've been looking at it and thinking about getting it, but wish it were in that spreadsheet form, beginning this week, because I'm going to be doing my August update at the end of July, at least my first August update, and I'll give a second August update as we get into the meat of training camp, or just before the season starts. I will, I'll have those updated on spreadsheets from that point on. So you can find it at mattwaldman.com. You can learn more about my work at mattwaldmanrsp.com. I have a TikTok account, so if you're into TikTok and you're interested in that, I'm posting a lot of videos, clips of podcasts and things like that. You can find my podcast at Matt Waldman's RSP Film Room, and I'm renewing the Scout Talk episode with head of U.S. Scouting for the Montreal Alouettes, Russ Landy. We're going to be doing that probably every other week throughout the season and throughout the draft period. Mark Schofield and I will probably be reconvening to do our quick game stuff probably every other week this year. And that's it. The usual grind in addition to that.
I think I'm gonna have to download TikTok now. my wife's on it. I'm gonna have to see what the buzz is about.
Well, Jeff, if you're going there, we're just going to give you we're just going to create an SS handle and just have you run it then, and maybe we'll have to start expanding our social
media. That's probably
media.
A mistake, Paul. But
guys, make sure you're following all of Matt's work, checking out all the stuff, all amazing content, one of the best in the industry. So go check out all that great work. So on behalf of Matt, on behalf of Jeff, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nicano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.